They said I was lucky to have a sister like Elena. I believed them for nearly 8 decades, until the afternoon I opened that box in the attic and found my mother's handwriting telling her otherwise. You were always the better one. I never knew what to do with the other girl. That was me, the other girl. The phrase didn't even sound cruel at first. It just sounded factual, like a weather report from a long season of silence. But something in the tone, controlled, deliberate, almost proud, made my breath go shallow. I sat down on the attic floor, among the smell of mothballs and forgotten linens, and for a long time I couldn't tell whether I was trembling from the cold or from the truth finally speaking back to me. I am 82 now. I rent a small room above my niece's garage, the kind with slanted ceilings where you bump your head if you stand too quickly, but I still have that box beside my bed. It waits like a living thing, full of words written before I was old enough to know what words can do to a person. That attic had always been Elena's kingdom. When she died, her house was divided neatly between her children, and I was given what no one wanted: the old clothes, the china too chipped to sell, the boxes that smelled of paper and dust. I volunteered to clean it myself. They offered to hire someone, but I insisted. I told them I wanted to say goodbye properly, though that wasn't quite true. I think deep down, I wanted to see what she'd kept. There's something revealing about what people choose to store away, the things they can't quite throw out but don't want anyone else to notice. I expected the usual remnants: birthday cards, travel photos, maybe our father's watch. I didn't expect a box labeled 1953, 1957 in Elena's tidy handwriting. The years caught my attention. They were the years that separated us most sharply, the ones I remembered only as fragments: our mother's sharp voice through a thin wall, the smell of her perfume before a night out, Elena's laughter coming from another room. The attic was dim, just one narrow window filtering light through cobwebs that looked like frost. I remember brushing my hand over the top of that box and leaving a clean streak in the dust. There was something strangely intimate about it, as if I were touching a scar that had finally stopped bleeding. I opened the lid and found letters stacked neatly, bound with a faded blue ribbon. My mother's cursive, elegant, consistent, spilled across every envelope. To my dear Elena, not one bore my name. I told myself she must have written to me too, that maybe my letters had been lost or destroyed, but even as I formed the thought, I knew it wasn't true. My mother wrote only to one daughter, and it wasn't me. I sat there reading, letter after letter, until the light changed from gold to gray. They began innocently enough: updates about neighbors, about the weather, about dresses she'd ordered from a catalog. But there was always a line that cut. Your sister is struggling again. She doesn't seem to understand her place. I sometimes wonder what will become of her. The words were polite, but the disdain hid just beneath them like dust under furniture, always there, waiting for the slightest touch to rise and fill the air. I had grown up believing our mother's distance was simply the way she loved, carefully, from across the room. I thought her quietness was a form of grace. Reading those letters, I saw it for what it was, a form of rejection so thorough it had turned itself into tradition. For a while, I tried to remember the good parts, the birthdays, the times she brushed my hair and hummed some song from her youth. But even those memories felt borrowed after what I'd read. It was like realizing the photograph you cherished all your life had someone else's face faintly visible in the corner, smiling wider than you ever did. I thought of Elena, 10 years older, always so composed. People adored her for that. When our father died, she became the family's anchor, the one everyone called first, while I was the one who baked the casseroles and kept busy in the kitchen. She'd sit at the table taking calls, speaking in that calm, practiced tone, and when she hung up, she'd give me a grateful little smile, as if I were the help. I never questioned it. It felt natural that she led and I followed. But up there, reading, I saw how that pattern had been written long before either of us had a chance to choose differently. Our mother had cast the roles, and we had simply grown into them. There was one line that broke something inside me completely. Don't let her near the piano. She'll only make noise. I remembered the piano, the old mahogany upright in the corner of our living room. I used to wait until the house was empty to play. I wasn't good, but I loved the sound, the way the notes filled the silence. I thought my mother just wanted quiet. Now I saw it wasn't about the noise. It was about who was allowed to be heard. I folded that letter slowly, my hand stiff, and realized that for 70 years I had been obeying a command written in ink before I was even old enough to read it. It's strange, the way betrayal can feel both ancient and fresh at once. My mother's been dead for more than 60 years, but her voice still found me in that attic, steady as ever. I remember thinking how absurd it was that a woman who'd been gone so long could still tell me who I was. And yet there I was, following her sentences like they were instructions I couldn't stop reading. I felt grief, yes, but not for her. I grieved for the girl who spent her life trying to earn a love that was never being offered. I grieved for the woman who grew into that girl's silence, who learned to apologize before speaking, who called it politeness when it was really fear. When I finally came down from the attic, it was almost evening. The house felt heavier, like every wall was listening. I made tea in Elena's kitchen using her favorite china, and the clink of the spoon against the cup sounded almost disrespectful in the quiet. I tried to imagine what she'd say if she knew I'd found them. Probably nothing. Silence had always been her language of choice. But I wondered if she'd ever felt guilty keeping those letters, knowing I'd never seen a single one. Did she believe she was protecting me, or did she simply like being the chosen one? The truth is, I'll never know, and that's its own kind of cruelty. When the people who hurt you die before you understand how deep the wound goes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the paper rustle in my mind, the scratch of pen against page, my mother's measured handwriting spelling me out of her life, one graceful sentence at a time. I thought of burning the letters, but even then I hesitated. Part of me wanted to preserve them, not as proof of her cruelty, but as evidence that I had finally seen it. It's one thing to be unloved. It's another to know exactly how it was done. So I kept them. I packed the box carefully and brought it with me when I left. Now it sits beside my bed, and some nights, when the air is particularly still, I take one letter out and read it again, not to wound myself, but to remind myself that I survived. People talk about healing as if it's a gentle process, but sometimes it's more like archaeology. You dig through layers of dirt and memory until you find what's been buried. And when you finally hold it up to the light, it's covered in cracks, but it's still there, undeniable. That attic was my excavation site. The letters were my fossils, and the woman I became afterward, she's the one doing the cataloging, the one who no longer needs permission to tell the story from her side. I suppose that's why I'm telling it now, because for most of my life, I thought silence was the price of peace, that keeping quiet kept families intact. But what good is peace if it's built on pretending you never existed fully? The truth is messy, and it arrives late, but it arrives. I found mine in a box with a blue ribbon in the attic of a house that never really felt like home, written in the hand of a woman who gave me life, but never gave me love. And somehow, against every expectation, that discovery didn't destroy me. It woke me. The attic dust is still on my skin, but I'm not afraid of it anymore. It's just proof I went looking for what was mine all along. The right to be seen, the right to be remembered, the right to speak after a lifetime of being the other girl. It began with the smallest detail, the sort of thing you almost miss until it settles somewhere under your ribs and refuses to leave. On the 5th letter in the stack, dated July 1955, my mother wrote to Elena, "Your sister has been accepted to the teacher's college, but I'm not sure it's wise to encourage her. You know how sensitive she is, and she's never had your discipline. It might be better if she stayed close to home, at least until she learns to be useful." The word useful hung in my mind like a curse. I could picture her writing it at the dining table, the lace cloth pulled perfectly straight, her pen angled just so, her hand steady with certainty. Useful, that was the word she used when she wanted to reduce something to a function, to a purpose, like a tool or a chair or a servant. To her, people were only as valuable as their service. Elena, the nurse, the caregiver, the respectable woman, useful. Me, the dreamer with a half-paid scholarship and a head full of stories, something to be managed. That letter was the moment I understood that what I had always believed to be mild disappointment was in fact design. My mother hadn't merely failed to love me. She had orchestrated the conditions of my invisibility. The next letter deepened it. There she thanked Elena for keeping me busy the previous summer, noting that it's good for her to have structure. She tends toward melancholy when left alone. Melancholy, such a delicate word for what was really loneliness. I was 19 that summer, working part-time at the library, reading novels during lunch breaks, writing in a journal no one ever read. Elena had found me that job, called it an opportunity, but I see now it was a way of keeping me contained, like a pet with a fenced yard. Reading my mother's gratitude for it made me feel suddenly foolish, like I'd been performing a role written long before I auditioned. I remember setting the letter down and looking around the attic, realizing that every item stored there, every folded tablecloth, every cracked teacup was evidence of her perfectionism, of the way she built control out of objects. Even in death, she'd managed to organize the narrative. The boxes were labeled, the photo albums curated, the correspondence preserved. And there, hidden among the neatness, was the proof of her cruelty. It wasn't the loud kind, the kind that leaves bruises or broken glass. It was the quiet social sort that passes for good manners. It's astonishing how much damage a soft voice can do when it carries authority. I kept reading. The later letters began to mention me less and less, until finally, by 1957, I disappeared altogether. My mother's attention had turned entirely to Elena's career, her engagement, her bright future. I became a ghost in my own family, omitted not by accident, but by consensus. That realization struck me harder than any insult. You can survive being disliked, even being pitied, but being erased, there's no defense for that. I felt the years collapse in on themselves, each one folding into the next, and suddenly I was that girl again, standing in the doorway of our kitchen, waiting to be acknowledged. When I finished the stack, I sat for a long while with my hands in my lap. The letters spread before me like autopsy reports. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I thought about calling someone, Elena's daughter maybe, but what would I say? Your grandmother despised me in writing. Families don't want the truth. They want continuity, the illusion of decency. I could already hear the polite deflection in my niece's voice, the one people use when you start to speak about something too real. I decided I would not give them the chance to dismiss me. That night, I went through Elena's desk drawers, something I had promised myself I wouldn't do. I told myself I was looking for a will, for practical papers, but I knew I was searching for context, for anything that might explain why she kept those letters all these years. In the bottom drawer, I found a photograph, one I had never seen before. It was from our mother's funeral. I stood on the left, eyes red, shoulders hunched, and Elena was beside me, immaculate as ever, one arm around me, but looking away from the camera. On the back, in Elena's handwriting, were 3 words, me and mother. No mention of me at all. I can't explain the sensation that followed, except to say it was both rage and clarity. It was as if a window I had always assumed was glass turned out to be a mirror, and I was finally seeing the reflection straight on. I realized then that I had been the family's unacknowledged burden, the emotional custodian who carried everyone else's grief while my own went unspoken. Even after Elena married and moved away, I remained close, always the one who remembered birthdays, who came for holidays, who cared for our mother when she grew frail. And yet, in her letters, my mother wrote to Elena thanking her for handling things from afar, as if I were some nameless nurse. I had done the labor. Elena had received the praise. The next morning, I woke up with an ache in my chest so heavy it felt like someone had been sitting on it all night. The light came in through the attic window in long, slanted beams, illuminating the dust in the air, and I thought absurdly that it looked like the ghosts were finally visible. I gathered the letters into a stack, tied them again with the ribbon, and set them in my lap. The paper was delicate, edges browned, the ink slightly faded, but the words were sharp as ever. I whispered them aloud once, just to hear the tone. My mother's voice emerged in my own mouth, controlled, precise, unyielding. It frightened me how easily it came back. I carried the box downstairs and placed it on the kitchen table, next to the teapot and the half-empty jar of sugar. I sat there staring at it, feeling like I was waiting for something to happen, a thunderclap, a sign, an apology whispered through the floorboards. But of course, nothing happened. The only sound was the ticking of the clock above the stove. That's when I realized the betrayal wasn't in the letters themselves. It was in the silence that followed them. All these years, no one had thought I deserved to know. They'd built a whole narrative around my supposed fragility, my delicate nature, when in truth, they feared what I might say if I ever saw the record. They feared I might stop being grateful. I made myself tea the way my mother used to, strong, no sugar, and I drank it in long, deliberate gulps, as though each one could wash the taste of her words from my mouth. It didn't work, but the ritual steadied me. I needed to decide what to do next. For a moment, I imagined confronting my niece, showing her the letters, forcing her to read them aloud until she, too, tasted their poison. But what would be the point? She'd grown up in the myth of Elena's goodness, the same myth I had helped sustain. Breaking it now would only make me the villain in a story they didn't know was a lie. Instead, I began to plan something quieter, something that belonged to me alone. I would keep the letters, not as relics of pain, but as a private record of truth. I would not let them disappear into another attic, or worse, into someone else's sanitized version of history. I decided that someday I would answer them, not to send, but to write, to restore balance in ink. The thought comforted me, like the beginning of a map. That was the moment of betrayal in full light. It wasn't a single wound, but a revelation spreading through me like a slow burn, connecting decades of confusion into one continuous line. Every dismissal, every half compliment, every careful exclusion, it all led here. I had always wondered why I felt like a guest in my own family. Now I knew. The invitation had never been real. When I left the house that evening, the sun was sinking, and the air smelled of dry leaves and something faintly metallic, like old coins. I locked the door behind me, not out of duty, but out of finality. As I stepped down the front path, I thought of my mother's last line from that last letter. I trust you'll keep her occupied. Even in death, she was issuing commands. For the first time in my life, I chose not to obey. I turned toward the bus stop at the end of the street, the box of letters in my bag, and felt the peculiar thrill of disobedience. Small, private, unstoppable. That was the day the foundation of my past cracked clean through. The day I stopped being the dutiful daughter and became the witness. The first weeks after bringing the letters home were filled with a silence so dense it seemed to rearrange the air. I couldn't sleep without hearing the scratch of a pen that hadn't moved in 60 years. And I couldn't sit still without feeling the box's presence somewhere near me, as if it had begun to breathe. It wasn't just memory anymore. It was a kind of haunting, the gentle and relentless pressure of words refusing to die. I placed the letters on the small desk by the window where the afternoon light fell in narrow stripes, and for days I avoided them, convincing myself I was done with the discovery that knowing was enough. But knowing, I've learned, doesn't bring peace. It invites disquiet, a steady hum beneath the skin. And in that hum, something darker began to move, a realization that this wasn't just about what they'd written, but about what they'd built out of their silence, the scaffolding of an entire life story that had kept me obedient, grateful, invisible. During those early days, my body betrayed me first. My hands shook when I poured coffee. My throat tightened when the phone rang, though no one ever called for me anymore except my niece, who checked in every Sunday, her voice brisk, efficient, full of duty, but no curiosity. She'd ask if I needed groceries, if I was taking my medication, if the heating was working, and I'd answer as politely as if she were a social worker. I never mentioned the letters. How could I? They weren't just family secrets. They were evidence of a lifetime spent as the footnote to someone else's biography. Even saying the words aloud, my mother despised me, felt obscene, like cursing in church. One evening, I sat at the window and watched the streetlights come on one by one. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that hides 1,000 private despairs behind drawn curtains. A cat moved along the fence, tail flicking like a metronome. I thought about going for a walk, but couldn't bring myself to open the door. I was afraid that if I stepped outside, I might look like someone who had nowhere to go. And the truth was, I didn't. The house, Elena's house, had been sold within weeks of her death. Her children divided the proceeds, and I received a polite note thanking me for helping with the cleanup. The words were typed, unsigned. Even in their gratitude, the omission persisted. My name absent from the story. The following morning, I made myself open one letter at random. It was dated December 1956, the year I turned 20. My mother wrote, "Your sister's temperament worries me. She reads too much and eats too little. I fear she will become one of those women who waste themselves on imagination." I read that line 3 times. Waste themselves on imagination. I had thought my love of books, of writing, was my refuge. It turned out it had been my rebellion all along. And rebellion in our family was an unforgivable crime. I folded the letter carefully and laid it aside. But my eyes caught something written in the margin in a different hand. Elena's. Just one word. Agreed. That word undid me. It was so small, so polite, yet it carried a lifetime of complicity. I realized then that the betrayal wasn't confined to our mother. Elena had been her echo, the living extension of her judgments. It wasn't malice, perhaps, but loyalty, the kind that blinds you. Still, it burned. I walked around the room in slow circles, clutching my hands to stop them from trembling. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar, the light from the street below casting faint bars across my face like shadows from a cage. I thought of all the times Elena had told me I was too sensitive, that I read too much into things, and now here it was, written proof that she had agreed with every dismissal. Days passed like that, quietly collapsing inwards. I began to avoid mirrors. I started sleeping during the day and staying awake at night, reading the letters over and over until the words lost meaning and became only shapes, black lines curling across yellowed paper. My body felt heavier, but my mind was alight, frantic, alert to every echo of the past. Sometimes I'd hear my mother's voice in the ticking of the clock, slow and certain. Sometimes I'd hear Elena's laugh in the creak of the floorboards, a sound that used to comfort me, but now made my heart race. There's a particular kind of madness that comes from uncovering a lifetime of lies too late to confront their makers. It isn't the loud, dramatic madness of books or television. It's quieter, almost dignified. You move through your days as if underwater, aware of the world's noise but detached from it, carrying a private current of disbelief. I'd go to the market, smile at the cashier, exchange small talk about the weather, and all the while, a part of me would whisper, "They didn't want you. They never wanted you." It wasn't self-pity. It was revelation. The truth had rewired me, and there was no returning to ignorance. One afternoon, I decided to organize the letters chronologically, as if order could impose logic on cruelty. I laid them out on the floor, careful not to smudge the ink, and as I worked, I noticed the handwriting shift slightly over the years, strong at first, then thinner, more hurried. It struck me that even my mother's disdain had aged, its precision fading as her body failed her. By the final letter, her penmanship wavered, yet her tone remained sharp. There was something grotesquely beautiful about that. The persistence of contempt surviving the decline of flesh. I wondered if, in her last moments, she had thought of me at all, or if she had simply trusted Elena to continue the silence. That evening, a storm rolled in. The wind rattled the window panes, and rain tapped against the roof in frantic rhythms. I sat by the lamp, the letters spread out like offerings, and felt an odd sense of communion. The house seemed to breathe around me, the old wood shifting, the pipes sighing, and I imagined my mother's presence, not as a ghost, but as an idea dissolving. I spoke to her then, quietly, the way you might speak to a photograph. I told her I knew. I told her I forgave her, though forgiveness was not the right word. It wasn't absolution I sought. It was release from her expectations, from the hierarchy she built, from the lifelong habit of diminishing myself to fit within her narrow version of affection. The next morning, something in me began to shift. The world outside hadn't changed, but my posture had. I caught myself standing straighter, breathing deeper. Even my reflection looked less tentative. Yet with that awakening came another kind of ache, the realization that I had wasted so many years trying to earn love from people who measured worth in obedience. It wasn't just my mother and Elena. It was everyone I had ever chosen afterward, every friend or lover who preferred my quietness to my truth. I had been rehearsing their approval my whole life, mistaking it for safety. In the days that followed, I began to see small signs of how thoroughly I had been shaped by their narrative. When the postman knocked, I apologized before taking the mail. When a neighbor greeted me, I lowered my eyes out of reflex. Even the way I stirred my tea carried a kind of deference. It was humbling to realize how the body remembers what the mind forgets. But alongside that humility came a spark of defiance. I began to practice small acts of resistance, standing a little longer in conversations, answering questions with full sentences, taking up space at the market counter instead of stepping aside. They were trivial gestures, but to me they felt revolutionary. One night, unable to sleep, I returned to the letters once more. I read them slowly, this time not as a daughter, but as a witness, an archivist cataloging evidence. The cruelty was still there, but it no longer pierced. It was distant now, almost academic, and I could see the patterns clearly. The same phrases repeated, the same corrections disguised as care. She means well, but she lacks discipline. She's imaginative, but not practical. She should learn gratitude. The refrain of my life. I realized that their language had become my inner voice, that for decades I had been narrating myself in their syntax. That was the true inheritance, the grammar of self-erasure. By dawn, I was exhausted but strangely calm. I gathered the letters back into their box and placed my own notebook beside them. It was time to begin my responses, not to them, but for myself, to reclaim the narrative one sentence at a time. I wrote a single line before sleeping. You cannot be the other girl in your own story forever. When I woke, the storm had passed, and the world outside smelled clean, as if the air itself had been rewritten. I knew the silence would return, that grief never truly ends, but I also knew this was the beginning of something else, something dangerously close to freedom. It was late autumn when the shift began, though at first it felt less like a turning point and more like an exhaustion that had finally run its course. The leaves had fallen, their edges curled and brittle against the sidewalks, and the air smelled of rain and smoke. I remember waking one morning and realizing that I had stopped listening for my mother's voice in the house. For weeks, her words had followed me everywhere, whispering through the creak of floorboards, echoing in the rhythm of my steps. But that morning, there was only stillness, the kind that doesn't suffocate but simply waits. I sat at the window, a cup of weak tea cooling between my hands, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel accused by my own reflection. I was tired, yes, but the kind of tired that precedes decision, not surrender. The letters were still on my desk, their blue ribbon loose from overuse, but they no longer frightened me. They were objects now, evidence, nothing more. The fear had shifted into something quieter, something like purpose. I began to move differently through my days. It started with cleaning, not the mechanical kind that fills time, but the deliberate act of reclaiming space. I sorted the drawers, folded linens, threw out things I had kept only out of obligation, souvenirs from other people's lives, cards signed without affection, trinkets from birthdays where my presence had been treated like a courtesy. Each object carried its own small echo of dismissal, and with every discarded thing, I felt a little more visible to myself. The attic had been their archive. My small rented room became mine. The walls were plain, the furniture sparse, but they held no lies, no history that belonged to someone else. It was strange, building a sanctuary out of absence, yet somehow it worked. In the evenings, I began writing. At first, my words stumbled. The sentences were stiff, uncertain, shaped by decades of politeness. I didn't know how to sound like myself. My whole life, I'd written letters that began with apologies. I hope I'm not a bother. I know you're busy. I just wanted to say. But now, sitting in the quiet, I decided that if I was going to write, it would be without preface. The first entry in my notebook was simple. I existed. They erased me, but I remained. The ink bled slightly on the paper, a dark smudge spreading like a bruise. I stared at it for a long time, realizing how easy it is to mistake pain for evidence of being alive. The more I wrote, the more the house itself seemed to change. It was as though the air had been waiting for me to fill it with something other than regret. Even the sound of my pen scratching across the page became comforting, rhythmic. I wrote responses to the letters, not arguments, but corrections. When my mother described me as sensitive, I wrote, I was perceptive. When she called me impractical, I wrote, I was hopeful. When she accused me of weakness, I wrote, I loved more than was wise. It wasn't about vindication. It was translation, turning cruelty into clarity, reclaiming the language that had defined me for so long. After a few weeks, I gathered my courage and left the house. It had been months since I'd gone anywhere without purpose, and the air outside felt unfamiliar, heavy with moisture and the faint sweetness of rotting leaves. I walked without destination, letting my steps choose the direction. Eventually, I found myself in front of the old public library. The building looked smaller than I remembered, its once white columns stained gray with rain. I hadn't been there since the summer I was 19, the summer my mother had thanked Elena for keeping me occupied. I hesitated before going in, half afraid the ghosts of those years might still be waiting behind the circulation desk. Inside, the smell was the same: dust, paper, a trace of floor polish. Rows of shelves stretched before me like corridors of memory. My fingers brushed the spines of books I had once shelved as a student worker, and for a moment I could see my younger self moving through the aisles, shy and eager, believing that a quiet life devoted to books would make me acceptable. That girl had wanted so badly to be useful, to justify her existence through service. I wanted to reach back and tell her she already was enough, even then. At the reference desk, a young librarian looked up from her computer and smiled. She couldn't have been more than 25. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. Her tone was kind, not the perfunctory politeness of duty, but genuine curiosity. The question startled me, though I couldn't say why. I almost said, "No, I'm just looking for what I lost here." But instead I smiled back and asked if I could use the reading room. She nodded, gesturing to a corner where sunlight pooled across long oak tables. I sat there for hours, reading nothing, writing nothing, simply existing in the presence of silence that didn't accuse me. It was nearly dusk when I left. As I walked home, I realized something had changed internally, though I couldn't name it. The world looked less sharp, less divided between pain and survival. Even the faces of strangers seemed softer, as if they too carried unseen letters of their own, words written by people who failed to understand them. I began to sense the vastness of all our unspoken stories, the invisible chorus of women who had been mislabeled, underestimated, politely dismissed. The thought didn't make me bitter. It made me feel less alone. That night, I pulled out the photograph of Elena and me at our mother's funeral, the one she'd labeled Me and Mother. For the first time, I didn't flinch. I looked at my younger self, the slump of my shoulders, the awkward grip of my hands, and felt something close to compassion. That girl had been trying to survive in a story already written against her. It wasn't her fault she didn't have the right lines. I took a pen and wrote on the back of the photo, "Her name is Martha. She is not invisible." Then I placed it inside my notebook, next to the letters, not as evidence, but as correction. The following days carried a strange calm, like the aftermath of a long storm. I continued writing, not every day, but often enough that the notebook began to fill. Some nights I reread my mother's letters, but they no longer hurt the same way. They were part of the record, yes, but they didn't own the narrative anymore. I began to understand that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about absorbing it, letting it settle in your bones until it no longer demands attention. The letters would always exist, but so would my responses. For once, the dialogue was equal. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. I received a letter of my own, not from my family, but from a small local historical society. They were organizing an exhibition about women's domestic lives in the mid-20th century, and had found my name listed as a reference in an old employment record from the library. They asked if I'd be willing to contribute any written materials or recollections. At first, I laughed. The idea that my life, with all its smallness and quiet pain, could be considered part of history seemed absurd. But then I thought of my mother's box, the letters bound in their neat ribbon, her confident script narrating my existence from the sidelines. If her words had survived 6 decades, why shouldn't mine? That night, I opened my notebook again and began transcribing. Not everything. Some wounds are too intimate to exhibit, but enough to tell the shape of things. The routine, the restraint, the subtle humiliations disguised as family order. I wrote not for revenge, but for record, because I realized that history is not made by those who are remembered fondly. It is made by those who refuse to vanish quietly. When I mailed the envelope to the society a week later, I didn't expect an answer, and perhaps that was the point. It wasn't about being seen by strangers. It was about stepping beyond the narrow frame my family had drawn for me. Standing at the post office counter, I felt an unfamiliar steadiness, as if I were finally inhabiting my own outline. The clerk took the envelope and said, "Anything fragile inside?" I almost smiled. "Only the truth," I said, and meant it. Walking home through the cold evening, I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't felt in decades, a sense of beginning. The letters had been my undoing, yes, but also my map. They had led me back to myself, to the woman I might have been if love had not been rationed out like sugar during wartime. I knew there were still shadows ahead, confrontations waiting to happen, but for now, the quiet felt like freedom. I had written myself back into the story, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of how it would end. It started with a phone call that should have been impossible. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the area code, our hometown, made my pulse quicken before I even answered. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen, the digits swimming slightly as if refusing to come into focus, and when I finally picked up, the voice that greeted me was hesitant and young, carrying that unsteady mix of care and guilt I had once known in my own. "Aunt Martha, it's Claire." The name meant nothing at first, not until she added, "Elena's daughter." I hadn't heard from any of them since the funeral, not since I'd been thanked in that unsigned note. She sounded nervous, her words tumbling over each other. "I'm sorry to call you out of the blue. I found something, well, someone did, at the estate auction, and I think it belongs to you." I didn't answer. The sound of her voice felt like being touched by a ghost. She went on, explaining that one of the buyers who'd purchased boxes from Elena's attic had come across a stack of letters addressed to her mother, and within them, a few that mentioned me. She thought I might want them, that perhaps they had sentimental value. I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat and came out as a cough. You can send them, I managed, if you still have them. She hesitated, her breath crackling softly through the line. I could bring them myself. I'd like to see you if that's all right. Against all reason, I agreed. 2 days later, I found myself standing by the window, watching the gray smear of a car pull into the narrow drive. Claire stepped out cautiously, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, her movements careful, as if approaching something fragile or half-wild. When I opened the door, she smiled with that particular politeness people reserve for the elderly, the one that tries to hide discomfort behind warmth. She looked like Elena, same straight posture, same calm eyes, but there was an uncertainty in her manner that her mother never had. We sat at the kitchen table, the box between us. I wasn't sure if I should open them, she said, fingers tracing the edges of the wrapping. Some of them are old, from Grandma, I think. And one of them, well, it's about you. I told her she could open it. I didn't have the strength for ceremony. She peeled back the paper, revealing a bundle of letters tied with the same blue ribbon. My stomach clenched at the sight. The handwriting was my mother's again, that same merciless elegance. Claire handed me the top letter. I didn't need to read it to know what it contained. I could feel it in my body, the old rhythm of judgment, the cadence of control. But I read anyway. It was from 1958, the year after the last letter in the original box. Elena, it began, I hope you are well. Your sister has taken a position at the library, which seems to suit her temperament, though I worry she still lives too much in her head. She insists on paying her own rent, which I suppose is admirable in its way, but she has no sense of proportion. I fear she will regret her independence soon enough. I read the line twice, though I didn't need to. The words didn't hurt anymore. They simply confirmed the architecture of the past. My mother had turned even my self-sufficiency into a flaw. I set the letter down. Claire's eyes were fixed on me, full of questions she was too polite to ask. I told her about the other letters, about finding them after Elena's death, about reading everyone. I didn't cry, didn't soften the story. She listened, pale and still, her hands folded on the table like a penitent's. When I finished, she said quietly, I think Mom knew. She must have, but she never said anything. The confession landed between us like a shard of glass. Of course Elena had known. She had kept the letters, hadn't she? Preserved them, hidden them, maybe even reread them. I suppose she thought she was protecting me, I said. Or maybe she just didn't want to disturb the story she liked best, the one where she was the good daughter. Claire nodded, biting her lip. Then, to my surprise, she reached across the table and took my hand. You were never talked about unkindly, she said softly. Just not talked about at all. It was meant to comfort, but it only confirmed what I had always suspected. Silence, after all, is just cruelty with better manners. After she left, I sat for hours at that table, the ribbon still undone, the letters spread before me like a map of betrayal that somehow kept expanding. The wind rattled the window, and for the first time, I felt not sorrow but anger. Not wild, destructive anger, but the steady, deliberate kind that sharpens rather than consumes. It was as if the years of compliance had condensed into a single, solid thing inside me, a weight I could finally name. I realized how thoroughly I had participated in my own diminishment, how easily I had mistaken endurance for grace. For most of my life, I had believed myself incapable of hatred. But that night, I understood that hatred was not the opposite of love. It was its residue, what remains when devotion curdles. The next morning, I took the letters to the park. The trees were bare and the benches slick with dew. I chose one under a linden tree and began to read through them, methodically, as if auditing an account. They were as predictable as they were cruel, criticisms dressed as observations, affection rationed out like medicine, approval withheld as a means of control. But there was something new in seeing them outdoors, in the open air. They seemed smaller, flimsy even. The wind lifted the corners of the pages, and I imagined the words scattering, losing their authority. I wanted to burn them, but it was too public, too theatrical. Instead, I folded them back into their envelopes and placed them in the waste bin near the path. It wasn't destruction I sought. It was dismissal. They no longer deserved to exist in my home. When I returned, a letter waited in my mailbox. The handwriting was familiar, but uncertain, slanted as though written in haste. It was from Claire. "I told my husband about our conversation," she wrote, "and he said I should tell you that Mom's papers are being archived at the university. There's a section about family correspondence. If there's anything you don't want made public, you should know." I read the line twice, my heartbeat quickening. My mother's letters, our private history, would become part of a public collection, a curated version of our lives for strangers to interpret. I felt the walls around me contract. They had silenced me in life. Now they would preserve the silence as legacy. The next day, I called the university. The archivist, a pleasant man named David, confirmed the collection. "It's a small set," he said, "mostly personal correspondence and notes. You're listed in a few items, but only peripherally." That word again, peripherally, the polite erasure of a lifetime. "I'd like to see them," I said. There was a pause. "That's possible," he replied, "but we'll need a written request. These materials were donated by your niece with some restrictions." I thanked him, though my voice trembled. I knew Claire hadn't meant harm. She was continuing the pattern without even realizing it. The archive, after all, was just another attic, a more formal one, filled with the same hierarchy of who gets to be remembered and who gets to be footnote. That evening I drafted the letter of request. I wrote it carefully, as if the act itself were a declaration. I signed my full name at the bottom, Martha Whitmore, daughter of Agnes and sister of Elena. It felt strange, using those titles again, but necessary. A few weeks later, I received a formal invitation to view the collection. I dressed with unexpected care, gray wool skirt, navy sweater, the brooch I'd inherited from my grandmother, and took the early train into the city. The reading room was hushed, the air dry with the faint scent of paper and dust. A young woman with wire-frame glasses led me to a table. "You're here for the Whitmore correspondence," she said brightly. "It's quite remarkable, such insight into mid-century domestic life." I wanted to laugh, but it came out as a sigh. The folders were laid out before me, pristine, labeled in elegant type. I opened the first, and there she was again. My mother, her ink eternal. Letter after letter, every judgment preserved. But what stunned me most was the discovery of one I had never seen before, one addressed not to Elena but to me. The envelope was unsealed, the paper slightly crumpled, as if handled often. Dated April 1959. "Martha," it began, "I've decided not to post this. Some things are better left unsaid, but I'll write them anyway so that they exist somewhere, if not between us. You think I was hard on you. You're not wrong. But I did it because you were the weaker one, and the world doesn't spare women like you. I tried to make you strong, and if I failed, then perhaps you were never meant for strength." My eyes blurred as I reached the end. She signed it simply, Mother. No apology, no affection, only justification. I sat there for a long time, the noise of the city faint through the thick windows. I could have left the letter there, could have let it rest among the records of other people's curated truths. Instead, I requested a copy. The archivist hesitated. These materials are restricted, but when I met his gaze, he relented. I'll make an exception, he said quietly. I left the building with the copy folded neatly in my coat pocket, its presence heavy but grounding. On the train ride home, I watched the landscape blur by, gray fields dissolving into shadow, and thought about what it meant to be deemed weak by someone who had never known the difference between gentleness and frailty. When I reached home, I unfolded the letter and placed it beside my notebook. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or pity, only a strange gratitude that the truth, however cruel, had survived long enough for me to claim it. I took up my pen and wrote beneath it, "You mistook kindness for weakness. You mistook silence for consent. I survived both." I kept writing until the words became almost illegible, until my hand cramped and the page was thick with ink. I wasn't writing to her anymore. I was writing to the generations of women who had been told the same lie, that endurance was failure, that softness was a flaw. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, the city lights trembling in the distance, and felt something inside me settle into clarity. I realized that the archive, the letters, even Claire's call, had given me what I didn't know I needed, a final confrontation. My mother had spoken her last word decades ago, but I had answered. The silence was no longer hers to define. In the morning, I sealed her letter and my response in a single envelope and addressed it to myself. When it arrived a few days later, I placed it in the drawer of my desk, not as inheritance, but as evidence that I had met her in the only place left to us, the space between truth and survival, and that for once I had the final word. It happened quietly, without ceremony or witness, on a morning so ordinary that it might have slipped unnoticed through the folds of time, if not for the decision I made before the kettle had even finished boiling. The letters lay where I had left them, a pale mound of history on the desk, waiting like obedient ghosts. Outside, the world was washed in a thin, colorless light, the kind that comes just before rain. I sat there, holding my cup in both hands, and realized that I could no longer live surrounded by the evidence of my own disappearance. It wasn't grief anymore that haunted me. It was repetition. I had spent months circling the same orbit, reading, writing, remembering, forgiving, cursing, and now the cycle had worn itself out. What remained was a simple truth. It was time to act. The decision came without drama, the way a shadow merges into evening. I would no longer be the keeper of their version of me. The letters had been preserved in attics, archives, boxes, and now my own room, each space becoming a shrine to their authority. My mother's handwriting had survived 3 generations of silence. That was impressive, but I had no duty to continue it. If she wanted permanence, she would find it in history books and curated collections, not in my home. I thought about the archive at the university, about the careful young archivist who had looked at those words and called them remarkable. Perhaps he was right. They were remarkable, not for their content, but for the way cruelty could disguise itself in civility. I decided to make my own contribution, one that would rewrite the story without erasing it. By midday, the rain had begun. The sound against the roof was steady and low, a metronome for resolve. I gathered the letters, the originals, the copies, the ones from the attic and the archive alike, and placed them in a single cardboard box. Then I added my notebook, the one where I had written all my responses, And finally, the envelope I had mailed to myself, my mother's letter folded inside. It wasn't destruction I wanted, but transformation. I wrote on the box in black ink, to be read in full. Then, after a pause, I added the other side of the story. It took me nearly an hour to walk to the post office. The rain had softened into mist, clinging to my coat, and the streets were nearly empty except for a few children splashing through puddles, their laughter thin but bright against the gray. I envied their freedom, their ignorance of inheritance. The box felt heavier than its weight should have allowed, as though every unspoken word of my life had been packed inside. At the counter, the clerk, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, asked where it was going. To the university, I said. Special collections. He nodded, weighing it carefully, and I imagined the label he printed would soon be affixed over my handwriting, bureaucracy sealing away emotion. Before he could ask the usual question, I said, "It's not fragile." He smiled politely, unaware of the irony, and handed me the receipt. I left the building lighter, though I knew it would take days for the box to reach its destination. That night, I dreamt of my mother. She was sitting at her dressing table, combing her hair, her reflection clear and calm in the mirror. She didn't speak, but her eyes followed me as I stood behind her, holding the box. When she finally turned, her face softened, not into affection, but into recognition. In the dream, I understood that she had always known what she was doing, that her cruelty had been a language she believed necessary, a way of protecting herself from the vulnerability she saw in me. When I woke, I wasn't angry. I was strangely at peace, as though I had been granted an explanation that required no forgiveness. A few days later, the letter from the university arrived. It was brief, formal, stamped in blue ink. Your additional materials have been received and will be appended to the existing Whitmore collection. A note has been added to the catalog to indicate new correspondence by the same family member previously referenced. The phrasing was bureaucratic but oddly satisfying. I imagined some future researcher years from now opening those folders and finding not just my mother's voice, but mine beside it, 2 generations speaking across time in a dialogue that neither had intended, but both had created. It would no longer be the story of a woman and her perfect daughter. It would be the story of the woman who was left out and then refused to remain silent. That evening, I sat at my desk, the space where the letters had once rested now empty except for a single candle. The flame flickered gently, throwing gold light across the wall. For the first time, the room felt mine. Not borrowed, not inherited, but claimed. The rain had stopped, and through the open window came the faint scent of wet earth and lilac. I breathed deeply, feeling the quiet fill me from the inside. It wasn't triumph I felt, nor relief, but something subtler, steadier, the sensation of completion. I had given back what was never mine to keep, but even peace has echoes. A week later, Claire called again. "I saw your name in the catalog," she said, her voice uncertain. "You added your letters, didn't you?" I could hear something like admiration mixed with fear. "Yes," I said simply. It was time. There was a long pause before she spoke again. I think Mom would have been angry. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "She was angry most of her life," I said. "It didn't stop the truth from existing." Claire hesitated, then asked softly, "Can I read them?" "Your letters, I mean." I told her she could, but only if she promised to read them alone, without commentary, without family consensus. "Read them as if you don't know me," I said. "That's the only way to understand." She agreed, though her voice trembled when she said goodbye. I knew she might never find the courage to go through with it, but that no longer mattered. The words existed. They would outlive all of us. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes. The heaviness that had once filled my mornings was gone. I began walking farther, sometimes to the park, sometimes to the river, watching the current carry twigs and leaves downstream. The movement comforted me. The steady forward pull, the quiet inevitability of motion. I thought of my mother's letters drifting through time, her words now accompanied by mine, each dependent on the other for context. It occurred to me that perhaps that was what family truly was, a conversation that refuses to end, even when love fails. One afternoon, while sitting by the river, I took out my notebook and began to write again. Not responses this time, but reflections, fragments of thought that came without effort. I wrote about silence as inheritance, about the small violences that shape women's lives, about how easily affection turns into control. The pages filled quickly, as if the words had been waiting for release. When I finished, I read them aloud to the wind. It felt almost sacred, the act of speaking into open air. I no longer needed an audience or approval. The story had already entered the world, and so had I. That night, before bed, I performed one last ritual. I took the photograph from the funeral, the one that had haunted me for so long, and placed it in a new frame. This time, I cropped it. I cut out Elena's face and my mother's gravestone in the background, leaving only myself, standing awkwardly but upright. I looked at that younger version of me, the one who had not yet learned how to vanish, and whispered, "You made it." I set the photograph on my bedside table, beside the candle, and let the flame burn low until sleep came. In the dream that followed, I was back in the attic. The boxes were gone, the air clear and bright. Sunlight streamed through the single window, catching the dust in golden suspension. I walked across the floorboards and found a single letter lying there, blank except for one sentence written in my own hand. You were never the other girl. I woke with tears on my cheeks, but they weren't bitter. They were the kind that come when something long buried finally finds its way to the surface. Morning arrived soft and blue. The rain had returned, gentle, persistent, cleansing. I brewed my tea and watched the light shift through the steam. The world outside my window looked unchanged, but inside, everything was different. I no longer felt like a survivor of someone else's story. I was the author now, and though I had no readers, I had finally written something true. I didn't know what the rest of my days would hold. Perhaps quiet, perhaps more rain. But I knew I would meet them as a whole person, no longer fractured by other people's definitions. And that was the true act, the irreversible one. Not the mailing of the box or the public declaration of truth, but the private reclamation of my own voice. For years I had spoken in borrowed tones, repeating phrases designed to keep me small. Now, when I spoke, even to myself, the sound belonged entirely to me. It was low, steady, a little rough at the edges, but it was mine. In the end, that was all I had ever wanted, to exist without permission, to tell the story without waiting for approval, to be remembered not as someone's sister or daughter, but simply as the woman who refused to stay silent. The quiet that followed was unlike any silence I had known before. It was not the hush of fear or obedience, not the vacuum that follows cruelty, but a kind of measured stillness, an equilibrium between absence and peace. The air in the room seemed lighter, as if the weight of all those years had finally diffused into the walls, leaving only faint traces of what had once been unbearable. Each morning now began slowly, without urgency, the light slipping through the curtains, in thin, forgiving ribbons. I no longer counted the hours or filled them with tasks meant to prove my worth. I simply let them pass. There is a strange relief in realizing that no one is watching you anymore, no one waiting for you to perform the role of the reliable, manageable woman. It feels at first like loneliness, but then it begins to resemble freedom. Sometimes, as I sit by the window with my tea, I think about how much time I lost trying to be understandable to people who never intended to listen. I wonder what kind of life I might have had if my mother had written different letters, or if Elena had questioned her instead of agreeing with her silence. Perhaps I would have married, had children, filled a house with noise and arguments and unwashed dishes. Perhaps not. The truth is, I no longer feel curiosity for those unrealized versions of myself. They belong to a future that could only have existed under someone else's approval, and I am done with living inside imagined permission. What I have now is not large or dramatic, but it is wholly my own, a room that holds my books and the sound of my breathing, an address that belongs to no one's story but mine. The letters are gone, and yet they remain, not as paper, but as lessons carved quietly into thought. I do not resent their existence anymore. They were the scaffolding I had to climb to reach the air. Without them, I might never have looked so closely at what silence does to a person, how invisibility becomes habitual until you no longer notice yourself fading. Sometimes, when I pass a mirror, I stop and meet my own gaze deliberately, the way one might greet an old friend who has returned after years away. I nod slightly, and the reflection nods back, as if to say, "You're still here." That small gesture feels more real than any apology I ever waited for. Claire visits now and then. She brings small things: a loaf of bread, a photograph she's digitized from her mother's albums, sometimes just conversation. She's careful at first, testing the boundaries of what we can speak about. But little by little, the fear has left her voice. A few months ago, she told me she went to the archive and read both sets of letters. It felt like hearing two people speak across a wall, she said. One voice trying to explain the world, the other trying to survive it. I asked which one she believed. She smiled in that hesitant way of hers and said, "Both, I think. But yours stayed with me longer." It was not forgiveness, nor was it flattery. It was an acknowledgement, and that was enough. We talked for hours after that, not about the past, but about ordinary things, recipes, books, the way the rain sounds on different roofs. It felt like a conversation between equals, something my family had never allowed before. As winter approached, I found myself drawn more often to the river. Its steady movement comforted me, the water thick and dark beneath the pale sky. The world kept flowing forward, indifferent to memory, and in that indifference I found a peculiar grace. I brought a notebook sometimes, though I rarely wrote. I would watch the children feeding ducks, the old men smoking in silence, the women walking briskly in their coats, and I'd think how each of us carried our own archive, invisible but vast, filled with the words we never received and the ones we never dared to say. There's a dignity in that unspoken library, a quiet testimony to endurance. I used to believe I needed to be understood to feel real. Now I see that I only needed to understand myself. One evening, as I was leaving the riverbank, a woman stopped me to ask the time. She was perhaps 50, with weary eyes but a clear, open face. We spoke briefly about the weather, about the approaching rain, and when she smiled in thanks, something in her expression struck me as familiar. That mix of self-containment and exhaustion that women carry when they've spent too long keeping peace at their own expense. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to tell her everything, to warn her not to wait until she's 80 to reclaim her voice, but I didn't. I simply wished her a good night, and as she walked away, I whispered quietly into the dusk, "Find your attic before it finds you." The words surprised me. They sounded like a blessing. At home, I wrote that phrase down on a slip of paper and pinned it above my desk. It has become my quiet mantra. Find your attic before it finds you. Go into the places you've sealed shut. Open the boxes. Read what was written about you before you had the power to define yourself. And then decide what still deserves to exist. The act will hurt. It always does. But what comes after the hurt is something like clarity. And clarity, I've learned, is the first form of peace. The seasons turn more gently now. I no longer keep track of the days in the way I used to, with the anxious precision of someone afraid of running out of time. Time, I've realized, is not something to be spent wisely or wasted foolishly. It's something to be inhabited. Every morning I open the window, breathe in the cold air, and listen to the faint hum of life outside. There are birds again, or maybe I just notice them more. Their songs are not beautiful in the conventional sense. They are repetitive, imperfect, sometimes harsh. But they are persistent, and that persistence feels like truth. I am not young, and I know that my life will not stretch much farther into the future, but I no longer measure it by what is left. Instead, I measure it by what has been reclaimed. The words, the space, the dignity of being fully seen, even if only by myself. I sometimes think of my mother, not as the woman who wrote those letters, but as a girl who was probably once silenced too, shaped by a generation that confused control with love. It doesn't absolve her, but it makes her human, and that humanity is all I can offer now. The other evening, I lit a candle and placed it by the window. It wasn't for her or for Elena, but for that younger self who waited decades to be allowed into her own story. The flame flickered, fragile but unwavering, and for a moment I thought I saw her there, standing in the reflection of the glass, smiling with the calm certainty of someone who has finally come home. Then the wind moved the curtain, and she was gone, leaving only the faint warmth of the candle's light. Now, when I close my eyes before sleep, I feel no need to pray for forgiveness or understanding. I think only this, that every woman deserves to tell her story before someone else writes it for her, that no truth is too small to matter, and that silence, however comfortable, is never peace. It is merely postponement. My life has been long, my heart weathered, my story complicated, but it is mine, and that after everything is enough.